tell my younger self as far as writing stuff, because a lot of this stuff is organic. You learn it as you go.
It's strange. It's nothing I ever expected.
I want to tell my stories by eliciting emotion in my audience.
So it's an organic process. They sort of layer on top of each other. Each one makes the next layer more obvious to me.
This whole thing could not have gone any smoother.
I usually say squad only in groups of 3. I like the batches, like squat, squat, squat.
Look, guys, this one's not going to be like normal. It's just not.
Welcome to the Writer's Journey. I'm your host, Lauren Moore, and with me is the Melwith, who is Kayleen Williams.
That's a big difference. It's like, are you talking or are you doing? What's happening here?
We still have all the pets that think, oh, it's time to eat. It doesn't matter if it's 4 a.m.
My name is Walt, and this is Coffee and Concepts on Keystroke Medium.
All right. Hey, welcome everyone. We're all
Looks like we're all busy.
I dug mine. Everybody hold your books up. So we don't have a title for this. I guess this is an official show. We're gonna do so. We all came across it. We're reading this book. We decided to read it and talk about it. So we're gonna do that. Lauren and Ken are here. I'm doing this fabulous intro. You're welcome. And very excited. So I don't know about you guys, but I first bought this book probably right after it came out. I mean, in the early 90s. And I read it, so 30 plus years ago. And when Ken and I were talking about the books, and after you had Tad Williams on the show, which is amazing, by the way, I was like, I need to read that again. And it's like reading a brand new book to me. I mean, I remember it, but it's also very fresh.
Absolutely.
So, glad to have you guys here. It's fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I checked out when the book was published, 1988.
I know. That's when I graduated high school.
It's a good.
I was a baby in diapers, so.
Very nice.
I was in high school.
Yeah. I was just graduating that. So I don't know how you guys want to get started. I mean, if we want to just rush into our thoughts, I'm feel free to lead if people don't have something. But if you want to go, I know Ken is by far the most organized of us in this particular endeavor, because he admitted to taking notes and making some things. I was worried, because I tend to be the slacker sometimes when it comes to reading speed. But fortunately I had to mow the yard, and I had skipped a week, so my grass is kind of thick, and I push mow it, and I got through 6 chapters. So nice. I'm caught up. It was amazing. And I'm very excited. So I didn't take notes, but now I have the paperback that I dug out of my archives, and I'm ready to go.
Well, before we go anywhere further, I think we need to acknowledge who got the golf clap of appreciation today.
Oh, yes.
And it's 100%.
That is Trucker Charlie D.
All right.
Very good. Very good. First one in the chat.
Fantastic.
And of course, we have Ken Britz here today. And
that guy get in there.
Jay Clifton Slater and Leo Vaccaro. He's here.
Thank you, folks.
Good old Leo. I miss Leo.
Yeah. Well, Ken, you came up with the idea for this book club, which we are embarking on today. It's going to be the first of many. We're starting with book 1 of this series with the Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams. So
isn't that a beautiful cover? I mean, yours is much better shape than mine, but
I'm just happy we all have the same cover, because they don't have. Probably part of this show we should talk about our disappointment in their change of covers over the years.
I initially was disappointed in the cover, but if you actually zoom in on it, on the new cover, you can actually tell which sword it is. For folks that don't know, we're reading the Dragonbone Chair, which is the first book in the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series. And if you don't know Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, they are 3 swords. So
Right. Yes.
Yes. But before we get started, I really wanted to talk a little bit about where you guys started with fantasy. Do you remember your first fantasy book? I think mine was a toss-up between, I want to say, you can judge me really immediately. It was either A Spell for Chameleon by Piers Anthony or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Those two were very close together. And I remember once I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think I ripped through the entire C.S. Lewis series very quickly. How about you, Lauren?
It might have been The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for me too. Back as far as I can remember, my parents were reading to us, reading books. That was, family time. That was something we did after dinner. All us little kids would be, helping to clean up while mom or dad, probably dad, was reading a book. We went through the Chronicles of Narnia. Later on, it was The Hobbit. It was The Lord of the Rings. There was another series about the Chronicles of Anthropos by John White, who his children also asked him for more Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Chronicles of Narnia books, and there weren't any, so he went ahead and wrote some more. So yeah, from really early on, just loved fantasy, loved kind of diving into a new world and going on an adventure and being inspired by the struggles of the protagonists. And so we had Tad Williams on the show a couple weeks ago.
Which is amazing.
Yes. Yeah. I posted about it in the Keystroke group, and so many authors were popping in to say, I love that book. It inspired me to write. And when I read that, I was like, oh man, this is my chance. How many times have I loved a book so much and I just wished I could read it for the first time? This is my chance to have that feeling again, to read.
This is your chance. This is your chance. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm reading it for the first time, getting into it, diving into it again. But for you, Ken and Scott, this is not your first time.
Yeah.
Just coming back into it.
Coming back. So I preferred, I write, of course, the military sci-fi space opera stuff. I read incredibly broadly, but I mostly read fantasy. If something that makes what I find the most enjoyment from, what I'm most gravitated towards is the fantasy books. And so I think that fantasy has influenced my writing more than any other genre. And this is one of those books. And so I was going, okay, I know that it set some hard wiring over the years. My first fantasy book was, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong because as I listen to more and more audiobooks, I realized that I wasn't pronouncing anything correctly as I was. But it was The Doomfares of Carmonde, which is by Brian Daley. And it's basically about a Vietnam vet that goes through a portal in an APC and has to fight dragons. And so I read that. Wow. And I read it because so my mom was a librarian and she started alternative schools, and she knew all the kids. Back before it was cool to be a nerd, we knew all the nerds, but we also knew all the teenagers. So they were all there. And she had this rule that if you came to the library and you behaved yourself, it was like a free zone and she wouldn't mess with you. And so they were all really well behaved and really respected her. But so when I was like 12, I was playing D&D with like seniors in high school. And they read, they introduced me to that book. They introduced me to the Elric books, the Melnibone, Elric of Melnibone. I always pronounce it differently, but I listen to that audiobook, and those are good. And then of course the Dragons of Pern and some of those Horse Clan books, Carl Wagner books, and then just fantasy after fantasy book. So it's very interesting.
It's funny you say Elric of Melnibone. I will swear for the longest time as a teenager, it was like, is it Melnibone?
That's how I've always pronounced this. Well, I listened to the audiobook like last fall, I think, and that's how the narrator said it. And so now I feel all fancy, but I've always said Melnibone, Elric of Melnibone.
That's like the narrator of Conan of Cimmeria,
right?
Pronounces it Cimmeria. I'm like, sure.
Yeah, that would throw me off. I have that sounds good. Earlier conversation too. So I'm tempted to get the audiobook and listen to this as I actually I have the audiobook for this, and I was going to read the paperback along with it. My problem is that I've been trying to read paperbacks and do the audiobooks and some books, and so I'm reading in a paperback book a book called The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is a fantasy. And Josh and I bought that like 4 years ago, and we were going to do a show like this with it. Well, neither of us read it. And I finally dug it out and I started to read it. So I'm reading that. I'm reading this. I'm finishing up the Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. I like Joe Abercrombie. And so I have like these 3 different fantasy books in my head at the same time. And when I was trying to remember what I was going to talk about on the show, I was like, I think I got some. I've always said that you don't have to worry about, you can read as many books at the same time as you want, because like if you watch a movie, if you watch Avengers and then you watch Smokey and the Bandit, you don't confuse the plots. But when you read these books that are 900,000 pages long or whatever, 3 at a time. Anyway, so I'm kind of rambling, but that's my first book. So that's my answer to your question, Ken.
Okay, good. So for folks that are listening in, I want to set a little bit of ground rules. If you haven't read the book, you actually really should. But we're going to spoil it, but only as we go along, because I'm not going to talk about things that happened. That Scott and I aren't going to talk about things that Lauren doesn't know about, but we'll just talk about the chapters as we go along. So we're probably going to spoil it. But if you haven't
only
read
chapters 1 through 5.
Only chapters 1 through 5, and including the very small foreword, if you saw that, if you read that. And in fact, I think that was the first thing I wanted to talk about is the foreword. It is kind of dense for that very short paragraph, and you really don't get anything out of it on the first read. At least I didn't. I don't know if Lauren did on the first read. And it was basically a very short text about a book, and you get a character that wrote about a book. So you get like a book within a book. So it's the what they call the epistolary.
The author's note?
Where you have little short beginnings before the beginning of the actual chapter. So, and I think Brandon Sanderson used the epistolary style in the Mistborn books. Tad uses it here, but he only uses it here in the beginning to kind of, I think, just give you a little bit of a flavor before you jump right into the first chapter.
Well, so you're talking about that. So you read those, and I've always known with lots of fantasy books that have it is so you read it and they have the quotes that are attributed to somebody. I'm like, okay, is this a real quote?
And who's that
nope,
guy?
that's a made up quote about it's in a made up book. But sometimes they're not. In some fantasy books, they will like quote Shakespeare or something weird. But it also, when I listen to the audiobooks, like in this case, I had no chance to look anything up because I was mowing the whole time.
Right.
And but like the Hayholt. So I remember the Hayholt. I'm like, is that a real word? Is that? So I'm going and looking up like definitions and stuff, but it's really a word that's specific to this story. It kind of feels like it's a real world that means real word that means castle. And I could be wrong on that, but I think it's made up.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's made up, and it adds, but it sounds like a word that could be
It sounds like I should. If I was smarter, I would have known that word already.
I would have made that one up myself.
Yeah, well, look, a hold is a castle. Is another word for castle or keep or whatever.
Like a bailey. Because I was thinking, hold, a bailey, all these different things that I'm researching. To do that. Like when I read Game of Thrones, I'm researching stuff constantly. Like I research like the Garens, the little horses and stuff, and all these things that are actually from real, but transposing fantasy. So I'm off track there. Anyway.
So that's a good point. But I think everybody I think it's pretty clear now that George R.R. Martin put Tad Williams in The Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn on his I guess reading list, or the book that inspired him to write A Song of Ice and Fire, right? And you can see that it does have quite a bit of influence. He takes a different style because he's a different writer, which is always great, right? But you can see where he's gotten some of that influence. But I don't want to get too much into that until on the differences.
Does that mean people are going to die? Is that what that means? It's already.
Well, I will say that I feel that, and you maybe already noticed this, Lauren, that the first, I guess, 10 chapters is okay, let me put it this way. You see that they are putting pieces on the chessboard, but you don't know who's playing what side yet, right?
Yeah.
You get characters. You get introducing characters. The characters are interacting with each other, some in good ways, some in bad ways, but you don't know who, except for the first character, right? Which is Simon. You know, he's got to be. He's almost a trope of a child, right? He's
he's an orphan boy.
He's the orphan boy,
Red-headed.
but instead of putting him the orphan farm boy, he's the orphan scullion.
Right.
And
even more intense.
Yes. And not to go back a little bit on some Tad Williams' influence, I think he initially wrote the Dragonbone Chair. Of course, he didn't finish the other two books until the mid-90s, I think. His influence was the what if idea of King Arthur. What if King Arthur's kingdom lasted, however long, and it had to go to his children? What happens then? So the characters that you'll introduce, I think if you put that in your mindset, you're like, oh, that's an interesting analogy of who that person is. But I don't think he follows very closely to the mythology.
Yeah, it's like
it's just a jump. It was just a jumping off point. It's like it's just the what if here, and that gives him all the ideas.
In a far future of Arthurian legend, what would the far future look like, or could it look like?
What would the far like? Yep. What if he conquered all the lands? He made peace throughout the land, but he gets old, which happens to everyone, right?
Yeah.
What happens next, right? So
it is very interesting, and I noticed that too, and I know that is a fantasy trope, especially when you have the hero's journey that starts with the young protagonist. You can see them grow up a little bit, and in the beginning, I'm kind of like, well, I know who I'm supposed to root for. I'm not quite sure what the stakes are. I know they're pretty serious, because we're talking about dragons that died and kings that are, on their way out, and you can see some political intrigue in there, but it takes its time. It's not in a rush. The hook seems like, I guess, subtle.
The Hayholt. Oh, good.
Yep.
Nope. Go ahead.
The Hayholt seems to be at the center of whatever this hook is and whatever the stakes are, because we know right from the start that history of hundreds and even thousands of years is going to be influencing the story today, and the Hayholt is kind of at the center of that history. It's like the touchstone. It's sort of a character. What we find, it's been there before man was there. It's been there before the Scythi were there, and it was like it's been there.
When they had the Tudor scholar guy was talking about the little people, but they're not little people, and he's telling that history kind of in his own slow, drawn out way. So there is that, people before man came here.
Yep. Well, let's hold that thought, because Simon is misremembering something, right? When he calls them little people, Dr. Morgan is talking about the little people as the different people.
Okay.
The people that built Asua and the Hayholt were not little people.
Well, and what's the teacher, the doctor's name?
Dr. McGinnis.
McGinnis.
Yeah, McGinnis, yeah.
Because he several times corrects him. He says they're not little people, and then he goes on, but he doesn't go back and correct him or explain it.
It'll come to you, Scott, when you get a little farther. You're like, oh yeah, okay, I get it.
It's just amazing how fresh how much I've forgotten. Although once I've read, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. But looking forward, I can't remember where we're going with this.
Well, Ken, before we go any further, can we just give like a summary of what the opening chapters are, like what the plot is at the very beginning?
Yeah, I thought we'd kind of go through a little bit chapter by chapter. And I put the first sentence of the first chapter in the intro. And I think it's a really long chapter. But it does, I think, a pretty good job or I should say really long sentence. It really does a good job of just sitting you into the world, like welcome in, right? It says, I don't know if you want me to read it or not, but On this day of days, there was an unfamiliar stirring deep within the dozing heart of the Hayholt.
It wasn't
In the
me.
castle's bewildering warren of quiet passages and overgrown ivy-choked courtyards, in the monks' holes and damp shadowed chambers. So you kind of immediately get, you are here. This is where you are. You're in some place called the Hayholt. It feels very old, right? I don't know. Almost feels like you're just kind of, a door opens when you read that first sentence and kind of pulls you into the journey. I don't know if you got that thought or not. So what are the characters you see in the first chapter?
Well, you have Rachel the dragon.
You get the first dragon, not the chair, not the dead dragon. You get Rachel the dragon, who's basically, I think she's the head of the chambermaids or head of the housemaids. She's in charge of she's the de facto in charge of the Hayholt, of mostly cleaning it, right?
Right. And she's kind of just, I mean, she's obviously not living up to her expectations. She does nothing but complain about him. It gets more interesting as to why that's the case as you go on.
Yep. And then you meet an ailing king, right? That's Prester John.
Mm-hmm.
And then, or at least they talk about the ailing king. And I think you do meet him in a very brief scene at the end of the first chapter. You meet Simon the dreamer, right? He's a dutiful worker, but you feel like he's waiting for something, right? And it's in his dreams, right? It's in his daydreams. He doesn't
seem like a dutiful worker to me.
He doesn't want to clean. He just wants to hear stories and fight dragons. And
yeah. There's several scenes where he forgets what he was doing and leaves the broom someplace.
And then I think you get a little bit of that, but and you see what I like is, and Lauren, did you get this feeling about that the words or for the names for places, they feel like they belong both in the real world and also possibly you get the fantasy names. When you hear Asua, that sounds fantasy-like, but when you hear Hayholt and Urchester and Rimmersgard, right, that sounds a little bit more of a blend of English type European phrases, stitched together.
Yeah, like some more Anglo-Saxon names close to home that have Bible kind of themes. But then we've also got some names that sound a little more Germanic or
like Duke Isgrimnur and Neban or Nebani.
Yes.
We're talking about the men with iron coming. Is that in the first chapter where he's telling the story?
No, I think that's in the second chapter.
Okay.
I'll get this. Well, before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit editor stuff. What are your thoughts on the writing style? Because this is going on a 40-year-old book.
Yeah. So what struck me about the style is a lot of the writing I see these days has a lot of dialogue and action type sentences, not a lot of storytelling sentences, not a lot of big paragraphs of description of the setting or the character. But again, it's more than just description. It's this like weaving of the story. It's reflection woven into what the character is doing.
Narrative storytelling.
Storytelling sentences. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's so common throughout the book, and it's right there in page 1. And it's something I read a lot in books from like the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. But it's maybe an art that needs to be developed, perhaps, by an author who wants to. But it's not as common today, and it could be that we're a little more fast paced with our story and our prose, and so we tend to kind of leave it out. But it's something that I, as an author, I find dialogues easy for me to kind of come up with and to create and to write. But the storytelling and the stepping back and kind of looking at the narration.
There's no white room in this book. Everything is described.
Right.
It's not, Josh and I were talking about some authors that you don't even know what certain parts that, like, you don't know what the characters look like or what their armor looks like or what the ship they're on looks like. But in this, everything's described, and he does a
Yeah.
great job. It's very lyrical in the way it flows through and tells all of that stuff. I don't know why there's been a shift away from that. Maybe it's because a lot of people don't do it well. It can become very tedious and boring if you're just describing everything. But he kind of feels like he describes it. I mean, some of it's obviously a setup. I get too overcritical for a writer. Like, he's just talking about this to give us some history, which happens, like, as you know, Bob, those types of things. Tell me.
Although we get that in chapter 2.
Yeah,
we get that in chapter 2.
But it's interesting history. So I guess that's where you get a pass, is like, you can do that info dump through, talking about the history of your kingdom. If it makes sense, they would talk about that, and if it's interesting. But I do agree with the style of that.
I think it's a style that the narrative style is lost a little bit in more science fiction thriller because of the pacing, the speed, and you lose. But at fantasy, a lot of fantasy requires a lot of pulling you into the world, right? It's very much
secondary
world, or it's a completely different one, right? So you need to know. You have to orient yourself. So you've got to take time to bring the reader in with you, right? You don't want to bore them, but you still want to just pull them along and say, here, look at this little boy, look at this, look at him, he's looking for frogs, things like that. What do you think of the point of view? What is the point of view?
I guess it'd be a third person. It almost, hold on a second, I gotta clear my throat. I
think it's
I drank an enormous amount of coffee.
Is it third person omniscient or third person limited?
It feels there's a little bit of omniscient to it. Whenever you get into what Lauren's talking about, where you're describing this broad panoramic view of the world, it almost has to be a little bit omniscient, or it gets very clunky with trying to come up with reasons they would talk about this. Like, hey, I want to say that describe the exterior of this castle. Now I need to get two people to talk about it or care about it. And sometimes it's easier as a writer, just tell them, just tell the story. We always say show, don't tell, which is very important. And I think it's because people abuse the telling, but nobody ever says, show me a story. They say, tell me a story. And so I think if it's done well, I think that you can do it both ways. A little bit of a digression, even though I loved it and I still do, is I had a hard time. The heroic stakes for me are not high in the beginning, because our hero, his biggest problem is that the chambermaid gives him a hard time. And I really want,
surrogate mother, adoptive mom.
He's being nagged, and he's being a little bit of a shit sometimes, because she has a case most of the time. She asks him to sweep a room. He comes back with 2 birds and no broom. I mean, I would yell at him too. Like, come on, I'm trying to prepare for the return of the king here, and you're off picking beetles up. I mean, give me a break. So my but somehow I'm still drawn into the story. So I'm very interested to see how this larger storytelling, as Lauren pointed out, brings me into the world. I'm so used to now being nabbed by an exciting, inciting incident early, and there really isn't one.
Yeah, it's the point of view is definitely third person, and then I'm kind of torn between limited to one character, or omniscient. Omniscient we can get into the heads of any character, or even that the narrator's kind of outside the story. However, Scott, you're just right in that a lot of the narration kind of puts us into a certain perspective about what's going on. It kind of pushes us to have a judgment maybe about characters, like by calling Rachel the dragon and such. But where do we get that from? That's from Simon, the main character.
Yeah.
And then you see that even more clearly when the POV shifts to Rachel's section, and Rachel's telling her story about Simon, and then we get Rachel's side of things too. And she's got a very different perspective. She, what does she call him? The moon calf and
moon calf.
Wicked child. That wicked child.
She's got she's up there risking her life.
Yeah, risking her life.
Yeah, she is. She is. And the perspective we're supposed to have of her, I suppose, is that she's, demanding, nagging woman. But Scott's exactly right. When you actually look at the details, she does have a case every time.
On my second reading of it, Scott, you'll know this, but Lauren, I have to note that every chapter, these first 5 chapters at least, there is some reference to an important character that you're going to see. I'll give you a one example. He is dreaming or thinking about some of the knights, and there's a knight called Sir Camerus, right?
Right.
He's in the first chapter. He becomes important, but you don't. It's just it's woven in, and having not read it before, it goes right past you. You're like, oh, that's just a name.
Kind of what I was trying to say before, is that just because I don't see the hook obviously does not mean it's not there, because it's one of those where things
it's
are
like sprinkling, just all the world buildings just being woven into the world, right?
He's layering it in there.
He's not just okay, here's religion and here's some history and here's some of it's all seen through the lens of Simon for the most part, with a lot of coloring by Rachel and Dr. Morganis. And I think we can just jump right into chapter 2. Is Dr. Morganis is right. Simon is goofing off, and he gets a task to go help Dr. Morganis to get him out of Rachel's hair. And he goes to Dr. Morganis. But before he goes to Dr. Morganis, he goes and goofs off and gets frogs. And then he goes to see it, right? So then he shows up with some frogs, hoping to get what? More story, right?
More stories.
He wants to know.
Which is a great excuse to give us a lot of background in the worlds. Like, I'm curious. Tell me some stories.
You get it by the bucket load in that second chapter, right? I mean, you just get a lot of info dump, right? In a good way, though, because it's Morganis telling a story, right? Because he's an old man. Maybe he's the mentor figure, right? He's the mentor that he needs to go on his hero's journey, right? At least that's my impression of him.
Right.
Seeing him again.
2 people warned me this book was a slow burn.
But I've never seen a slow burn that's not good, right? Well, okay. In this case, right? In this case, this slow burn is really worth it.
There's a payoff.
There's some slow burn where it just fizzles
and
out.
That's more true to the genre. That's really, most of them take more time.
True.
I haven't read Prior of the Orange Tree, but I've heard some of the indictments of it a little bit. Is that kind of crams a trilogy into one book, and it feels unsatisfying because it's got a lot in there, but it doesn't give it that room that sometimes a fantasy story.
I'm having a hard time with the Priory of the Orange Tree, because actually, for the same reason I bought this book is because I like the cover. So,
it's a beautiful cover. I like the Priory of the Orange Tree.
And then you read a little bit and you're like, I'll give it a try. And I'm having a hard time latching onto the characters. It's a lot different than this one. The characters, or there's more character right off the bat. But okay, so what else do we do in chapter 2?
There's one thing I wanted to note. If you notice that there are little whispers in to Simon, or he's imagining them. I don't.
Yeah, there's a part where he's somewhere in the castle, and he gets a little
feels
something.
like something is talking to him, right? Like,
yeah,
the little people. I guess that's in his mind.
Right. There's something going on with the Hayholt.
Yep, something going on with the Hayholt, and then we get into chapter 3, right? Which now becomes okay. So now we have three framing pieces, right? We have Simon goofing off, so you get the main character, who will become the main character of the story in the beginning. You get his mentor in the next chapter, and then you get what in the 3rd chapter? Do you guys remember?
Well, is that the Two Sons of the King chapter, or is that
Nope, farther back. It's a flashback.
His backstory.
It's Rachel beating cobwebs, and then she goes back and remembers when he was born, right?
Right.
So,
and how did
and you get
Dr. Morgani's had to make a difficult choice.
Yep. He had to make a difficult choice, right? She wanted to save the woman, not the child, right? And Dr. Morganis says, I don't get to make that decision right now. I got to make it when I'm there, that kind of thing. And
but there's the foreshadowing, and where that hook starts to come in is because when the Dr. Morganis, and I might be wrong the way I interpret this, when he realizes who the woman is and who the father is, he says, I have to save the child. And you're like, okay, so the little orphan boy actually means something in the larger scope of things.
Well, then you get that you have an idea that there's somebody important of his parents, right?
Yeah, and then she who's the father?
You just get who they are, but you don't know why.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One you think is a fisherman, the other one's a maid, I think.
Yep.
And then what's the other piece that you get? His real name, right? It's not Simon, it's Yeoman, right?
Oh yeah, you get his real name, right?
Waiting. His name.
So is it a real name? Is it a secret name? Does it hint at something else about him? Does it gives him a little bit more than just he's just the doofus kid that
she decides to call him Simon because it sounds similar to his real name, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But did she do that because that would cause problems, or is she just easier to say? I don't know.
I don't know. I think it might be a product of maybe where he's from, where his parents are from, because their mother was the one that named him, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Rachel is set smack dab in Urchester, which is the kind of the England of Austinard, I guess.
I have to look at my map because I'm like, oh, great guy.
Well, so the Hayholt is the castle.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave a great description in the beginning of that. It's just other conquerors built onto what was originally the thousands of years of history. And then Urchester is the city. So think of it as, the Queen's Palace and then London kind of around it.
Right.
It was compared to a honey-muzzled bear sleeping
that was
with
interesting.
Cubs.
Yeah, I wanted to point that out. I was like, there are so many. One of his narrative descriptive styles, Lauren, and I know you got this, Scott, of like the weaving the tapestry, is he's a super fan of metaphors and similes.
Right.
And they're all seem to be, at least initially in this first few chapters, are like animal related. So trying to remember a few of them, like as if herding skittish sheep, like a sleeping honey-muzzled bear among her cubs.
Yeah, or even that first line.
A badger in an apron.
Unfamiliar stirring deep inside the dozing heart of the Hayholt. So it's like this castle is sleeping, and what will happen if it awakens?
Yeah.
Right. It's slow burn, but good hints, right?
Well, the castle's obviously in decline, so that's a common fantasy trope as well. If we're talking about tropes and stuff.
Well, you get an idea that the kingdom may be on the edge of a tipping point, right? Because in the beginning, you get that 3 years, right? The king has been the doors to the main throne room have been shut for 3 years because the king has been ill. And that's the first chapter is really the opening of the doors, right? They want the doors open, and you hear about the sons being called home, right? To assume one of them to assume the kingship, right?
And one of them's. I hope you can't hear my dog if you can, because my dog apparently.
It's okay, we can hear him, but I can hear you better.
Yeah, because the dog is losing her damn mind out there. I'm quite sure how it'll be resolved eventually. We bought this house and we have lots of windows. We're like, well, we want the dog to be able to see the world. And now I'm like, no, that's absolutely the wrong way to go with this, because my dog barks at anything it sees. So going to that, so the two sons, are we up to them yet? The sons
That's
of the king?
chapter 3.
Chapter 3. So that's very interesting.
What's the word? Eavesdrops.
Right. He stumbled. He does that a lot. He's always hearing somebody's conversation he's not supposed to, which is a great tactic or technique for writers. It's like, I need to get some information here since it's limited third person. Is that what we decided it was? The POV, Lauren?
Yeah, I think
Limited.
limited.
Yeah.
Well,
So
mostly limited.
I think it's
mostly limited.
It's enough for jazz or government work, I guess. But that's the thing is you have to get that information through them. They have to be able to witness it. So you have to have these tactics to do that. I'm talking about from a writing's perspective, and that's one that's pretty common. And you got to be careful because it makes sense for Simon because he's clearly established as a kid that's underfoot every place. So it makes sense that he's going to hear things, But if you had like the captain, or it would be a better one, if you had like the armorer always hearing everybody, it doesn't make any sense because the armorer is just going to be in one place most of the time. Anyway, I digress. But
well, I mean, but I guess here's the other danger. Do you think that the conversation between Elias and is it Elias or Elia and Joshua is natural?
I forget their names.
Natural? Does it feel forced?
Yeah. Would they be talking about that? And I thought he did a better job in that scene than he did in other ones where it was a little more natural because he doesn't explain everything. There's in some of the other scenes, it's like, hey, tell me a story. And then he gives a lot of information. He breaks it up a little bit, makes it feel natural. But in that case, there are some things said in there about
there's a past.
Elliot losing his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And Joshua feeling responsible for it, and it clearly would have done anything to stop that from happening, but then also something about the daughter, but it doesn't go beyond that. So you have to do some work as a reader to get that information. And I think there's a book.
It's like Velcro, right? You get all these little hooks that are like dragging into you. You're like, I want to know more. Tell me more about this.
There's a book called Self-Editing for Writers, and one of their big tenets is resist the urge to explain. And a lot of writers, when their writing is not interesting or won't hold people, it's because they explain it too early. And like, now I want to know, but the only way I can get that information is to read further. But if they just tell me, then I know and I can put the book down.
Yeah. I find that as a new writer, I tend to write what I want to tell. And I ended up deleting most of that, taking that out. Just I would pull out most of it and just leave a couple of.
It's a danger from when you have editors and lots of proofreaders. So when I write for Cheney, he has a very large proofreader group. It's like 20 people on top of the two editors, and so they're all way smarter than me for one, but they'll be like, well, this doesn't make sense, and then I want to explain it right then. And it's very tempting to just satisfy that one person. And you have to decide, does this have to be explained now, or should I just get a little more clear in what I'm setting up and explain it? Did I not explain it intentionally, or did I just leave something out? But usually from a suspense standpoint, it's better to not explain as much as you feel like you want to, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. As the editor coming in, if there's a line or a scene that is confusing, and I write a comment that says something along those lines, like I don't understand what's going on. What I don't necessarily want is for the author to come out and explain what's going on, but what I would want them is for them to tweak their word choice just a little bit so that what's happening is clearly communicated, but not necessarily why, maybe not even how, but just be really clear about what's happening in that scene, what it is you're trying to say. Tell me very clearly what it is you're trying to say, but leave the clues in there for me to put together later.
Right. It doesn't have to be a long time later. Sometimes it can be like the next page.
Right. So that confusion from your proofreaders is a good thing, but it's not telling you to explain what's going on, but to rewrite it so that it's clear what you're trying to say.
Sometimes
does it have to be clear, or does it just have to leave a question in their mind rather than confuse them?
The writing, I think, has to be clear.
The writing has to be clear.
And the question has to be clear but unanswered, but it does. It's hard to really say. Clear is not the exact word I'm looking for, but like there's some little things like that. Like, I want to know who the father and mother are of Simon, but he's not going to tell me it, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
Example.
But
you get just enough information that you're like, well, who are they?
Right.
Maybe it's
really.
I want to know, and therefore now that's the definition of a hook. I want to know. I have to keep reading, and there's lots of them in there. It's not just one hook. There's lots of hooks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
that Dr. McGaney's picked up something that fell from the mother's hand as she died, right? He picked it up.
I was like, what
stuffed
about
it in his pocket? And Rachel saw that he did it, but also decided to trust him and not pressure him on it. So we have that clue that something is right there, and we're putting that in our head.
Well, it gives you two things, right? The what is it? And there's a relationship too, right? He gives us two things in a very short piece.
That's
right there.
Very concise, very powerful thing. That's a great example. That's a great example of packing a lot into a very small thing. You don't have to have 15 pages of something to describe it. That happened just in a little snap.
Right. And the author clearly told us what happened, but hasn't told us what the thing is or why it happened or why Rachel decided not to pressure him.
Told us what, but did not explain it.
Yes.
Not yet.
Not yet.
The other things that are hooking me is Joshua, one of the brothers, is missing a hand. So anytime there's a hand missing, you want to know what's up with the missing hand, what's up with the Hayholt, what's up with the people that were here before, the people who built the Hayholt here. There's lots of questions that are drawing us into this story world.
He's gotten good at those double things, right? Where he gives you a piece of information that he's not going to tell you, but he sticks it with something else, right? Like you said, he picks up something, but you also get an idea of the relationship. But with the what were we just talking about?
Joshua, he picked up something with his hand. He only has one hand
about
to
the
pick
missing
it up.
hand.
Yeah, he only has one hand to pick up a thing, and then what is that thing?
Well, he's missing a hand, but then you have this argument between the brothers over his I guess sister-in-law or his brother's wife, and you think maybe these two are related, right? He lost the hand because of
Did he lose his hand trying to save his there's also, and it's a little bit off of that, but there's the deal where they start the argument with, you need to not trust this religious figure or advisor or whoever. And so you see a future villain of some sort.
You get words of him, but you actually see him. I think it's in the 4th chapter. I think it might be in the 4th chapter. No, 5th chapter. So.
And that's a cool way to introduce a character, by the way, is to hear about him from other characters that are already introduced. They're fighting about him, and we've heard about him before we've even met him.
They do that a lot.
You're still not sure who's the good guy, right?
Right, true.
I don't know which brother is the good guy. I think it seems like Joshua is the good guy, but he may not be. Elliott's been painted as kind of the martial guy that's probably going to do mean things to people, but that's just my first impression.
Well, so Joshua is the what? He's the
eldest.
The thinker.
Well, it's kind of.
I think he's the youngest.
Elliott's the older one.
Elliot is the oldest.
That's what I meant. Elliot seems like the guy who's gonna rule.
He's the more brash, the more ruler. And then Joshua's more of the thinker, right? In which, of course, Elias thinks you think too much.
Well,
right?
Elias, they're
thinking too much is a problem.
They're fighting over a woman, right? And Elias is married to her, so you think the husband loves her the most, but he's the one who pulls out the handkerchief, the silky handkerchief, I guess, from his wife, and throws it on the ground. He leaves it. And Joshua is the one who uses his one remaining hand, right? To pick it up and cherish it and keep it. Okay, so he definitely looks like the good guy in that little interaction, at least from the woman speaking here.
Yeah, you kind of get just the barest hint that maybe Joshua is, and you're not sure.
We don't know.
We don't know the backstory. We don't know the story behind the handkerchief.
We don't know the backstory.
We just know that it happened. It was cute.
Yeah, it was great. I want to talk a little bit about one thing that's really influenced my fantasy trilogy recently. Well, not recently, but since I've been working on it, and that's the role of religion. We get a lot of history. We get a lot of descriptions of things and things that have happened before. But steeped into that is this Edon kind of religion, right? It's something that I haven't seen a lot in fantasy. I think it's because of possibly Tolkien, maybe D&D, that, a pantheon of gods. Maybe it could even be Greek and Roman mythology, where it's like, let's have a whole bunch of gods, and let's not do the monotheism.
That's actually what it kind of stopped me from writing fantasy, because that's where I started writing. I wrote a lot of fantasy, but I didn't want to create a pantheon of gods. I'm not like a real preachy person religiously, but it always made me uneasy to do that. But I noticed in this, that they make several references to God, like something they'll say God singular. And I'm curious because I can't think of another fantasy novel I've read that has ever mentioned that. Now, like in Abercrombie's books, there are some people who think that way and other people who don't. So kind of like the real world, I guess. But anyway.
Yeah.
Continue with your thought.
What do you think, Lauren? What about your thoughts, Lauren?
It's too early to tell. I'm still trying to figure it out. The religion that's there seems perhaps a little maybe Catholic in structure, perhaps. Just because we get
a lot of analogs, right? A lot of analogs. Instead of a cross, you get a tree, right? You get instead of Christ, you get Osiris, right?
Well, set in a very medieval, like a medieval analog kind of culture. We've got definitely a religious structure, like a hierarchy. And we have, faith that the common folk have, and there's, faith that religious leaders are teaching. There's a savior figure who was on a tree with nails. So, kind of getting crucifix sort of thing. Definitely like self-sacrifice is a theme in the story from the start, particularly with the mom. The mom, when she gave birth, she lost her life giving birth to her son. She doesn't seem to have much choice in that scene. So it's not like she's, she doesn't say at any point, like, you have to save my son, even if you let me go. But she seems to kind of accept her fate as it's meted out. And fate is another part of a theme going on, like what's the hand here. But I'm still like, I'm really early on in the book, so I'm still kind of trying to figure out what is this world and how is faith being portrayed in the story. It's the jury.
It feels very much medieval, right? You've got the monotheism, you've got the Catholic analog, but you still got other religions if you pay attention enough.
And demons.
Not to the main characters, but to the other cultures that come in, and they have their own religions. They don't match.
There's definitely a spiritual world and spiritual forces that seem to be influencing people if they open the doors to them.
Right. And it's interesting, right? Because it brings it doesn't actually bring the history of our own world there, but it can give you the echoes of that, right? They have saints and they have phrases of saying, blessed Riap, save me, things like that, right?
That's kind of what I was
saying,
that's felt
Osiris on the tree, give me a break, kid. Things like that. Yeah. I thought that was really interesting to mix monotheistic cult religion with polytheistic culture, which is what we had, right? We had a lot of polytheism. You had a lot of historical records of accounts of just religions just being adopted by whoever was, it works for them. We'll take that religion, and throw it over and add it into ours. Right?
So, well, and lots of, like in D&D and lots of fantasy, they crib a lot from like Greek gods or from Norse myth and stuff. So they're going to have a pantheon and things like that. I think with a lot of writers, it's not intellectually cool to just express if you happen to have Christian beliefs, you kind of get bashed for it. And but I think it just really depends. I think it should be story dependent because the characters are going to be from different backgrounds. You know, if you wrote a historical novel based around the time of Christ, you would have a whole bunch of different religions there.
And every character you've seen so far, you think are pretty much mostly mono of the
Right.
Cyrus.
It's not real heavy on it. Like in all of the very detailed description of the castle and the little people and all the stories they tell, they don't do the same thing with the religion. So they're not beating you over the head with anything. It's just the phrases they say, you know.
Yeah.
It's
like
just, again, woven into the fabric of the story.
Right. It's just, you know, just people talk how they talk.
Religious or blasphemous or a bit of a mix, right? I really enjoyed that.
So it is interesting, and it's an interesting way for me personally as a writer to how to deal with it is just to write the story. Because I'm not really trying to convert anybody or express my beliefs or get positive feedback for where I believe one way or another. I'm just telling the story so that the characters is what matters in the story.
Yeah, you're not forcing something onto it. You're just presenting this. Here it is.
I'm not the writer that's trying to get some larger social message across. I think there will be social messages in there, but they're going to be dependent on what you take away. I can write, if I'm trying to write to convince somebody of something, they're still going to take away something different than what I intended because we're different people. And so I don't really write that way. I try not to anyway.
Well, I think you kind of get a little bit of the what's the word? The strength of the religions, the characters. I think Simon is very loosely religious because he's just living amongst them, and he gets Saturday out at the market, right? And
we got some buzz.
Is that for me or is that from?
I think it's from you. Make sure you're plugged in all the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe microphone connection or something.
It's still a little rough.
Switch my audio to my.
It's probably my fault because I have like literally 17 windows open on my browser thing. I usually turn them all off before we do a podcast, but this time I'm like, I'm going to roll with it. I'm going to see if I can handle it.
Worst comes to worst, you can click out of the screen and come back in, and then often that fixes audio. But that's about all the technical know-how I've got.
Can you hear me now?
Is
that better?
I think you're back.
Yeah.
I think you're back.
All right. Switch microphones. Okay. Great.
Where are we at in the
chapter? We're at the end of chapter 4. But do you pay attention to? He sees something at the very end of chapter 4, and it's just a person. And I don't know if you got a hint of who that was yet or not. I don't know if you paid attention to that or not, Lauren. Again, it's just basically a little bit
the kid,
something that's seeded into the story that is not important till later.
Oh, the girl.
The girl.
Right. Yes.
You know who that is, Scott?
I'm not sure. I have some ideas, but and I think I might be talking about chapter 6. But he has a bunch of encounters with somebody who's also lurking around, and I'm wondering if that's the girl, but I haven't confirmed it tonight.
Okay. And then we jump into chapter 5 where you actually almost get a actual physical collision with the what we think might be the first, I guess, the villain, right? Or what we think might be what Joshua is hinted at, right? Pyretes. You run into almost runs Simon right over. Right.
Oh yes.
And he flashes by and you miss it, right? And then he runs into another brother, right? Cadrak.
Yes. In the marketplace.
Yep. And does stupid kid things, right? Uses his money. Has to go to get beat up by Rachel.
Right.
There's a whole so mad she doesn't beat him up, right? She just
spends time showing Cadrak around, and then for his trouble, he gets pickpocketed.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So I was curious about Cadrak. I didn't have the name, but I was curious is he a villain or is he somebody who just knows more about Simon?
Yeah, I'm not certain either. You know, I think I see him. We see him later, but you don't get much of an indication of what he knows, what he is. I think I don't know if he's looking for someone or he's just looking for companionship, right?
Or he's just gonna get a tour and then take his money.
Or maybe he's the thief, right?
Yeah.
Or a spy.
Or the spy. Yeah.
He's dressed up like a monk, right?
Good.
But that doesn't necessarily mean he is a monk just because he's dressed as one.
So,
and then go ahead.
I was thinking that the girl is the daughter that was referenced in the earlier scene. I could be wrong. Is that right? All right.
Yep.
Yeah. I knew it. Yay! I'm smart.
Got it. I got
before.
it. And then I think Simon knows he's going to get the tar beat out of him, right? So he decides to go run away, go to a hiding spot, right? I think it'd be towards the middle of chapter 5. And he goes
to eat his lunch at Green Angel Tower. And
this is where you get a different type of info dump, right? With Morgana's, you get a history lesson told as a story. And this one, you get a geography lesson. Right? He climbs all the way up and he explains everything he sees, right?
Yeah.
I'm like,
bird's eye view.
I'm looking at the map. That looks right. That looks good.
There you go.
Yeah, and then I think the last thing that happens is when he comes back, right? Because what he does to go up to Green Angel Tower, he sneaks into the throne room, right?
Right.
To squeeze out the door, and then he comes back, and then he runs into a character.
Because doesn't he touch the throne that's made out of the dragon bones?
Yeah, he accidentally touches it, right? Which, again, is it a hint? Or is it just playing with you? Right? Is he playing with you as a
there's something
foreshadowing or special about him? Or
or is it just a little kid giving his feelings? It's hard to know.
Well,
it's hard to know.
He got in trouble for not sweeping the Bailey or something. Think what he's going to do. He's been playing around on the throne. Better not ever let that get out. It'd be in big trouble.
And then I guess the last thing is he runs into Malachias, which I think is the end of chapter 5. I did want to see if you guys had any favorite sentences that you liked in these chapters.
I can't think of specific sentences. I love the flow of the descriptions in general with that sort of stuff. When he does just dive wholeheartedly into describing the castle or a person, it flows nicely. And there's a lot of unnecessary words that he uses. But so that's the thing is, I'll find an example here.
I like how he expresses the passing of time or the season, right? I think in the very beginning, he says autumn was holding the door and winter was trudging in. I thought that was a great way of saying it's getting cold.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. He does this stuff that I like the way it sounds, especially the narrator for that book is great, by the way. I can't remember who it is. But like from a strictly, White and Strunk style guide, there's lots of words like on this day of days, there was an unfamiliar. On this day of days, it feels like a form in the English language that's used, but I don't know if it's specific to the story, but it's kind of flowy. And then like he'll say, in truth, there was one person in the busy Hayholt. You don't need in truth, technically. There's lots of sentences like that, but for some reason they all work really well and I really enjoy it. So it's a little bit different style of writing.
It's a storyteller style, right?
That's his style. It's his voice, part of his voice that works for him that might not work for everybody else. Now you could over abuse that. If you did it several times in a row, it would probably become very tedious.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do love I love the honey bear nose.
You've done
honey nose bear.
You've done some editing of fantasy books, right? What are your thoughts on like italics for inner monologues? I'm interested in that because I've seen it.
I'm very interested in that too.
Yeah,
I've seen it in a few. You see it here, right? You get a couple of words by, or a couple of inner thoughts from a character, but I haven't seen that a lot in recent, more in a bit of newer fantasy, and I don't know if you've seen that or not yourself.
Well, if you talk to Steve Boyer, he doesn't think like an inner monologue you should use italics or quotes. It should just be self-evident in the way it's written. And I like that. I've read lots of books like that, but my beta readers for some of my stuff, that's become a point of confusion. So I usually try to make it a little more obvious.
Yeah, when it's a direct thought, like it's a direct, these are the words I'm thinking in my head, then technically it's supposed to be italicized, and that does kind of set it off and make it really clear to the reader. However, it's an author style choice thing.
As long as you're consistent.
Decide not to use it and not to use italics for direct thoughts like that. This book is using it for direct thoughts, even though there is a lot of internal monologue happening that's not italicized, as the character is essentially narrating the story as he goes along. But for example, here on page 32, or in Rachel's head, now, son, he thought he knew everything. And this is not italicized. God just made young men stupid, and that was that. Those girls had nearly spoiled him beyond redemption, and would have if Rachel hadn't kept her eye out. She knew what was what, even if these young ones thought otherwise. Things were different once, Rachel thought. And that was italicized, just that one little bit. And she thought...
it's very tiny pieces, right? He doesn't give you a page.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So if it's something like that, like a really little direct thought, and we're just making it clear that is a direct thought directly spoken to the reader, yeah, I'd say italicize it. However, again, if you have long chunks of italicized stuff, that's hard on the eyes, and then you might make the choice not to do that.
Again, I'm a much newer writer than Scott, but I feel like, and I, for the most part, I think I agree with Steve that you really it should be in the writing. But I think I think Tad has really shown a few instances where you really got to talk from that character to the reader directly.
I think if you start setting principles and rule that your highest priority is clarity, the absolute worst thing, well, there's two worst things you can do is you can bore your reader or you can confuse your reader, which is probably going to bore them. You do either two of those things are wrong, no matter what anybody tells you. And so I think, like you're saying, Tad Williams and his editors were like, this will be clear if we add that. But I find it interesting. It kind of flows seamlessly back and forth, like in Lauren's example. That's very interesting.
That's very good, right?
It works.
I found another line that I think just kind of breezes by that I feel like could be foreshadowing, and it's the conversation between the jester and the king, right?
Yeah.
And the jester says, all men must die, right? And it's a little bit of foreshadowing because, of course, Prester John is old, right? He's 90-something years old, and he's reaching the end of his life. And I thought that was a great line. Very simple.
I'm a little bit, I wasn't fond of, and maybe because I don't understand yet, that he would give this treasured sword to the jester to give to his son. That I'm not following the story logic of that particular element. And he confides in the jester, I'm probably saying it wrong, a lot, and then gives him this most powerful talisman in all the kingdom and says, hey, put this in your footlocker and make sure my son gets it direct. And I'm what are we doing here?
It has the nail wrapped around it, which gave it its name, right? Bright nail. And it's got the piece of bone, I guess, of a saint embedded in it. And that's what I wanted to point out in the new photo or the new image of the Dragonbone chair. If you look at the sword hilt, there's actually a piece of bone, and it shows the wrapped nature of the sword hilt, which I thought was. Well, I didn't like it initially, but then I was looking at it, I'm like, hey, that looks really interesting.
When I think I was talking about his newer books, not necessarily these books, but I would like to.
That's a great point, Leo. That's a great point.
Yeah, Leo says jesters were often confidants as well as comedians, and that's true. I think the fact that he hands off the sword to the jester shows just how much trust he puts in this person. So much faith and trust that he'll actually follow through. And
over anybody else,
exactly.
His kids,
right?
His children.
Will be a more important character than you would think. In the Wheel of Time, there's the main character who's the what do they call him? He's like a carnival guy, but he's actually very powerful.
Tom Maryland.
Tom Maryland. So he's not just a jester. He's a very big role in the history of that story world, and so I guess you got to be careful about the assumptions you make.
Gosh, you hit on something that I really wanted to point out very vaguely, which is I'm so glad that this series does not have a TV adaptation or a movie adaptation because it exists just in itself, and we don't have to compare it to anything else.
Yeah.
Because in the Wheel of Time TV show, Tom Maryland was pretty much erased. after the show, which is very unfortunate, right? Because he's a very good character. So, yeah.
It's difficult for the adaptations, and I think briefly on that is I don't think the adaptation should strictly follow the books. They need to be inspired by the books because they can't just they're different mediums. They should.
Yeah, you're not going to get one for one. You have to, but what you need is a faithful adaptation, right?
Yeah, and you got to pick
that carries it. Yeah.
You can't put everything in the book into a movie because the movie would be like 700 hours long, or whatever.
Well, I mean, what is that, 14 hours for the whole Lord of the Rings?
Well, my example was I listened to the audiobook for Clear and Present Danger, and it's 24-hour audiobook. And then they came out with a movie. I'm like, they're going to compress, because I figured an audiobook is more comparable to a movie than a printed book. Mm-hmm. But it's really not. It's still the same. You're taking all that and cramming it in.
Sorry, I was just thinking this brings up a really good point, Scott. So we all have the paperback copies. I got the paperback copies for you guys for this show.
Really awesome. All right. The best.
But I was listening to it on Audible first, and I am going to keep listening to it on Audible, and then probably keep reading it because I found the reading experience was different from the audio. How did you guys? How's it been for you?
I'll have to leave it to Scott because I'm reading it again.
Well, and that's the thing. I did the audiobook. I love audiobooks, but in this case, like I'm never going to get caught up if I don't just listen to it.
Yeah.
And so I just dove into it, and so I plan to go back and forth. So the next time we talk about this, if we have another episode of this, I will have a better answer for you, and I will have a very good comparison.
Okay. Well, I'll check back on you next time because I had a very different experience between the listening and the reading, and I think it's very cool. But more about that later.
See, now I'm very excited.
Man. See, now you should bring something.
Cliffhanger.
Cliffhangers.
We probably need to wrap it up because I have some family problems.
Yeah, I think I'm out of things to talk about. But I thought it was just really interesting how you got so much. It was slow burn, Laura, but you got so much information in 5 chapters. You got the character, you've got the situation in the castle, which nothing has moved yet. Nothing is changing with the world. You know it's coming, right? The children have come home. The father is dying, right? And
he definitely takes his time with in the genre, and I love coming into the story world. But when I went and dug out that paperback book, I found this is book 3.
Yep. Huge. That's a door stopper.
So it's part 1 and part 2 of book 3, and they're both bigger than the first book.
Wow.
So it's really
that was the first. I remember getting that, seeing the hardback version in the store, and it was like this big. And that's what Tad Williams was saying. The book was so big. When he split it in for paperback forms, it would not. The book binding for paperbacks would not hold
physically
that
can't
book.
print it. George R. R. Martin had the same problem with. I think it's the 3rd and 4th book of Game of Thrones was originally one book, but he had to break it because you literally can't make a book that thick and have it stay together. Yay for big books.
Well, I hope you guys really enjoyed this. I think it was a lot of fun.
This is great. And
a lot of stuff to talk about.
This is good.
There's just so much in the story, and just talking about world building and fantasy and the language and just the things steeped in what Tad Williams wrote, almost 40 years ago, right? Like 35 years that the Dragonbone Chair came out. So which means he probably spent 2-3 years writing it. Yeah.
It's very interesting to me, and I hope we keep doing it. I really appreciate your organization because it's been a very structured show. This has been great.
Good.
But I really feel like this book and several others like it that I barely remember reading, were very formative to my writing now. And I'm just very curious as I go through it to see what I've kept and what I've not kept.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting from a writer's perspective to come back to this story and say, wow, what's happening, right?
This is all about world building, and I get lots of compliments about my world building, but I don't consider myself a good world builder at all in my sci-fi. But a lot of it is I love seeing the imagery in these types of books. And so when it comes time to write it, I enjoy it. and I think it helps. But it really is, your early reading is very formative to your writing, and it's kind of it's an interesting jaunt down memory lane.
Yeah, it is. I think it's a lot of fun. I was hinting at to Lauren. I feel like Scott and I are escorting you on this book journey, right?
Yeah.
Come along with us. So we've been here before.
Yeah.
And then, of course, and you're like, this is all amazing. And then Scott and I are like, look over there, look at that, look at that.
Yeah.
You're not seeing everything.
Out.
I'm enjoying it, and I'm taking notes too. Like there, I can see weaknesses of my own as a writer of things that I want to work on, and one of them is that storytelling ability and to be able to help the reader to connect with the character and to connect with the plot by just giving them those little insights into what they're thinking and how they're feeling. So I'm kind of trying to immerse myself in the way he's doing that and pick up little tidbits to add to my writing too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just so far as we've gone. I think if you're somebody who's looking in how to do world building, then this is a masterclass in world building.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Yes. And also a masterclass in the slow burn build up, right? You're getting, it's not a rocket. It's an airplane that's very slowly just lifting you out of the atmosphere.
And it's plotted and it's planned. He was not a pantser. He outlined this before he went to write it, and it shows.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So okay, homework. The next 5 chapters.
Sure.
If we want to do it again, the next 5 chapters. There are 55 chapters, I think, total in the Dragonbone Chair. So it'll take us maybe 11 episodes to do. An hour seems to be a good amount of time to talk about 5 chapters.
All right.
Yeah.
And great.
Awesome.
Anything else, Scott? Lauren?
I think that's good.
We talk about all of our future shows, say to come back and that, but I don't know how much else planned right now, so I'm really glad we were able to get back into it.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I like talking about writing, but let's talk. I like this idea of talking about writing through the lens of something that we read before and that we just a couple of us loved and we're enjoying Lauren coming along the journey, and I think you're really going to like it because, like I said, the burn is slow. It's very, there's good high points in the book.
It made me a lifelong fan of Dad Williams. I even read some of his sci-fi stuff, which I enjoyed this more than his sci-fi stuff. But
I read his Otherland quadrilogy, which I enjoyed it, but I have a special place in my heart.
It was hard for me because that was before all the multiplayer online internet stuff was a big deal, and I bet you that book would feel completely different now the way the internet was, because he's kind of like the Neil Stephenson did Snow Crash.
William Gibson. Neil Stephenson, and then I think William Gibson was before Tad in writing Neuromancer, which I think was
and they're talking about all these worlds that exist only online. Well, it was hard to visualize.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's a whole other thing. Let's not go down that because we'll be here for 6 years.
Yeah, so everybody's interested in reading along, pick up the Dragonbone Chair. It's an ebook, an audiobook, and hardback and paperback, wherever you want to find it. And, we'll talk about chapters 6 through 10.
Yeah, everybody join in.
You guys really enjoy it.
Homework for everybody. Everybody go read the book.
Yeah.
All right.
And we'll see you in the group.
Yeah, we'll see you in the next time. Have a great Tad, everybody. Have a great read.
Night.
Night.